Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Livingston Landowners Group presentation regroup. My name is Jan, and I am joined today as moderator and host, or joining the presenters today as moderator and host. And I will be presenting formally Bobby, Alan, and Brad in just a moment. But I see that many attendees are logging on right now. So let's just give everyone a minute to get logged on, get settled, and then we'll go into the formal segment of this presentation. I will take a moment to just let everyone know that this is a live event and it is being recorded. So all of you who have registered will be receiving an email with a copy of this recording attached to it. So look for your inbox for that over the next 24 to 48 hours. All right, so I am just going to introduce all of you. I feel silly just having you here without me saying hello to all of you. So welcome, Bobby Lambert. Bobby, hello. Alan, welcome and hello. And Brad, welcome and hello. All right, so folks, just to let you know, this is a 2-hour presentation, we think, rough order of magnitude, and it will be divided into 2 segments. The first segment, we will hear from LLG speakers, Alan and Bobby, whom I've just introduced you to, and they will be doing a PowerPoint presentation and discussing the implications of coal mining and future recommendations as presented to the Coal Policy Committee. This will be about a 30 to 40 minute presentation, I believe. We're thinking about that, and we have left lots of time afterwards for a question and answer session. So I would ask all of you to, if you aren't familiar with Zoom already, just scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see a Q&A box. And as you think of questions and comments pertaining to their presentation, please feel free to enter them in the box, and we will get to as many as we possibly can within the first hour of this 2-hour presentation. The second part of the presentation will be Brad, and he will be discussing his study results on Old Man River watershed and the consequences of the coal mining headwaters. That also will be a PowerPoint presentation, and we have left lots of time at the end of that, once again, for question and answers. And we encourage you to keep your questions and your comments that pertain to the particular presentation that you're watching. So I think I've gone on long enough. I would now like to give Bobby the wheel of this machine and ask you to pull up your presentation and start. And just a reminder that Bobby and Alan, you are on mute. So when you're ready to speak, just unmute your mute.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I know that this past year for most of us, certainly in LLG and in so many other groups, has been just consumed by issues related to coal. And the context for the presentation that you're going to hear today is that the Coal Policy Committee, which was set up in March, is going through a process of hearing presentations from various groups and getting submissions from individuals in order to make a recommendation to the Minister of Energy about coal policy in November. So LLG had an opportunity to speak to the Coal Committee on July 13th, and we shared all of the information that you're going to be hearing today. The speaker lineup was a little bit different. We had an additional resource from LLG, John Lawson, and we also had another one of the scientists who was involved in the study that Brad led, Bill Donahue, and neither of them was able to make it to the webinar today, but we are covering all the same material. And in fact, we will also have a video of Bill Donahue, the scientist's presentation, posted on our website in a couple of days. So that's kind of the context. I'm going to share my presentation now and start to walk you through sort of the key messages. So let me just get going. Okay, so the things that we want to talk about today are really the what it is that we value and why we're so concerned about it, what the impacts of coal are going to be if the developments that have been proposed are allowed to proceed. And then we want to talk a bit about the things that the pro-coal people have been bringing forward as reasons why these projects should proceed. The cost benefits, you know, what are the current legislative protections, and our recommendations. So that's really the material that we're going to be covering. A little bit about Livingston Landowners. For any of you who don't know us, our organization was started in about 2004. And our primary mission is not to stop all development, to ensure that there is responsible planning, use and protection of the very rare and irreplaceable land and water in Southwest Alberta, predominantly in the Livingston Range and Porcupine Hills area. But one of the big learnings for us, certainly in the last year, has been that industrial development, you know, things particularly as egregious as coal, have impacts far beyond the actual geographic area that they occupy, which is one of the reasons why we've become so involved in this discussion. When we spoke to the Coal Policy Committee, we reinforced that we were there representing our organization and the members, but we also wanted them to be very clear that the concerns that we are sharing with them as part of this process are shared by the vast majority of Albertans. And we just pointed out two of very many different research efforts that have demonstrated this. One was an initiative we took back really in early 2021 that we undertook with CPAWS. And at that point, there was still a lot of people who didn't really know what was happening in the with respect to the coal policy changes. But even despite that, we found that the vast majority, 76%, strongly favored more protections in the eastern slopes. And then I think an even more compelling message went to the Coal Policy Committee just prior or just right after they had named the committee. The government went out with a survey and kind of asked Albertans what they knew about coal and what they thought about coal. They were overwhelmed with responses. More than 25,000 people in Alberta responded, and more than 90% made it very clear that they opposed coal development and coal exploration, and their major areas of concern were the eastern slopes. So, you know, we wanted to make sure that that was front and center in the discussion with the committee. So now I'm going to turn the message over to Alan. He's going to walk through these coal mining impacts and risks, and I'll pick it up a little later on in the presentation. So Alan, over to you. Alan, you're still muted.
Hello, I'm Alan Garbett, as Bobby said. For those of you who don't know me, I should admit to a rather unusual background. I have a PhD in wildlife biology and worked in consulting for several years before I went back to school and retrained as a rural doctor. I've dealt with everything from birth to death, or cradle to grave, as we sometimes called it. I've lived in the Elk Valley area, the Crozes Pass area, since 1992. LLG asked me to do reading and research on coal impacts, and I have seen way too many pages. I've read most of the Benga environmental impact assessment. I can't claim I read all of it. Who could tell if you'd missed a few pages out of the 26,000 they submitted? That whole document was assessed and reviewed by the Joint Review Panel. Grassy Mountain proponents would like you to believe that their mine will only have local impact. Unfortunately, that's not true. Any impacts they have on water quality and quantity will be felt across an enormous area that stretches literally from Waterton in the south to the Columbia ice fields in the north, and east across the prairies into northern Manitoba. That, if Bobby can get us back to the slide with the map, that area of land is home to several million people. 90% of the water that flows across the prairies in that basin comes out of the east slopes. Very little of it comes from anywhere else. So if we impact that water, we impact everybody downstream. The area that's encompassed there is 5 of the 7 largest population centers in Alberta. It includes most of the large population centers in Saskatchewan, because there's a diversion off the South Saskatchewan that supplies both Regina and Moose Jaw. Move to the next slide, Bobby. There have been numerous studies on the importance of the east slopes. They go back more than 50 years. Every one of them has recommended that we protect the slopes for recreational use and for water supply. Going even further back in the 1880s, the Dominion Forester recognized that these slopes were critical to the water supply on the prairies and noted that they should be left alone. When you consider that his main job was to provide lumber for development on the prairies, the fact that he said you shouldn't be cutting it down is probably a pretty important statement. For most of the southern prairies, the water from the South Saskatchewan drainage is the basis for all of our activities out there. As we've mentioned, almost all the water in that area comes from the east slopes. Much of it comes in the form of delayed snow melt and release. Almost all the rest of it comes in the form of the spring rains. Those of you who've been around here for the last few months know that we're not getting spring rains and we're not getting a lot of runoff this year. The water in that area shown in the South Saskatchewan map has been fully allocated in Alberta. There is no more water to be allocated to any new use. In fact, we've allocated more than all the available water. So if there is any large use planned, the water has to come either out of somebody else's prior allocation or by getting more efficient with the water that we're using. It's extremely important that we protect this water. The findings out of studies up in the Hinton area show what happens when mines are not abandoned, but closed. There's been mining in the headwaters of the McLeod River for approximately a century. The last of the metallurgical coal mines closed in the last 10 years. There is one pretty large thermal mine still going there. As the mines were closing, Alberta introduced a monitoring program looking at the water both upstream and downstream of the old mines. That program was scaled back in the mid-teens and closed off in 2016. The stuff I'm going to talk about here comes from Bill Donohue's study, which, as we've already mentioned to you, will be available through YouTube and the LLG website shortly. If you look at this map, at this chart, you'll note that almost everything in it shows substantial increases in a variety of minerals downstream of all of the mines. We've got things like selenium, arsenic, and lead that go up in most of these samples. The post-mining levels in virtually all cases significantly exceed the levels that they're supposed to be kept under to meet guidelines. Despite what the government stated, there has not been a significant drop in mineral levels in any of the measured materials over the decade since the mines closed. And if we move on from this, if we can see that there's significant impacts on human health. We don't have a lot of data in Alberta on the impacts of coal, probably because there hasn't been much coal mining near any population centers for several years now. But studies on the impact of coal have been done in a lot of other areas. The material presented by Benga to the Joint Review Panel looked at primarily at single acute exposures, which is not how coal is dispersed to the population. People living in the vicinity of coal mines are exposed to a continually changing mix of chemicals, and no one has a really good handle on exactly what they're exposed to. But the exposure problems are not acute, they're chronic, they're not single item, they're multiple items, and it's not even a fixed amount of any one material. The largest data set on what happens to human health probably comes out of Appalachia. A researcher by the name of Michael Hendricks, working with multiple other collaborators, has published more than 30 papers on the impact of living near a coal mine. In short, living near a coal mine is bad for you. There are increases in the numbers of premature babies. There are increases in the number of low birth weight babies. There are increases in lung and liver disease, heart disease, kidney disease. There are more cases of cancer, and there's an increased rate of dementia. It's not absolutely clear how this happens, but it's very well demonstrated in the epidemiology research that Hendricks and friends did. I might mention also that Hendricks has a relatively short 15 to 20 minute TED talk out if you want to look at that for a quick summary. The people who have done this research have even developed a timeline that tells you how long after a coal mine opens will it be until you start to see various impacts. Childhood asthma goes up in approximately 2 years after a mine opens. It takes about a decade before problems in the circulatory system, that's things like heart attacks and strokes, go up. And it takes perhaps 20 years or more before you start to see the impacts on dementia. The epidemiologists also looked at how much does all this increase in health problems cost. Their data suggests that the increased healthcare costs from all of the various problem areas more than compensates for the claimed economic benefits of a mine. To put it bluntly, opening a coal mine is a cost, not a benefit to the provincial coffers. There's a question on how this all happens. What is it that causes the problem? It looks like it's probably the result of the tiniest particles in the dust cloud that hangs over many of these mines. It's probably due to exposure to particles that have various names. They've been called less than 0.1 microns. They've been called nanoparticles. They've been called ultrafines. Regardless, they are tiny. They're hard to characterize. They behave somewhere between a gas and a solid, and they're difficult to capture on most of our monitoring equipment. In the studies that you see, most of the time, it will refer to them, if they're separated out, as very small weights of the ultrafine particles. That unfortunately is misleading because there are an enormous number of individual particles in even a gram of the ultrafine particle material. There's a much greater mass in the larger particles, but there's a smaller number of particles. And it's the large number of particles and their behavior that creates the problem. Because they're so small, because they move around in the slightest of air currents, they reach the deepest recesses of your lung. Regardless of whether they land on a cell at the front of your nose or deep in your lung, they have the potential to be directly toxic to the lung or airway tissues. More insidiously, the tiny particles can penetrate through that protective layer and get into either the circulatory system or even into the nerve cells. If it's in the bloodstream or the lymph, it can be transported from the lung to any of the organs, which probably explains why we have problems in the heart, the liver, the lungs, the kidneys that you wouldn't think of necessarily being directly exposed. The particles that enter the nerve cells seem to be able to migrate up the nerve cell into the brain and cause problems there. That's more than a little disturbing. When Benga presented their material to the Joint Review Panel, they essentially ignored the American research. They ignored the research from places like Colombia and India. They spoke only to acute exposures with single molecules. The information they presented said that material would not get off the mine site in any significant amounts. Unfortunately, their data was methodologically flawed, which is a fancy way of saying they were wrong. If you want an easy example, until late in their calculations and presentations, they claimed that the winds in Crow's Nest Pass virtually never exceeded 60 kilometers an hour. Anybody who didn't catch that error at about iteration 1 of the 12 bouts it took to get their proposals accepted for review just wasn't reading with a critical eye. Besides human health, materials that come out of coal mines also impact animals in a variety of ways. I've already noted that we don't have very much direct research on humans. We have quite a bit of direct research on animals. Selenium has been widely researched, and essentially it is a very potent teratogen for fish. It's a fancy way of saying it causes birth defects. In fish, it's concentrated mostly in the what's called the craniofacial area. That's the face and gills, and along the vertebral column. Many of the eggs and the youngest fry die quickly. The ones that survive, a lot of them are subject to predation because of damage to the vertebral column keeps them from swimming properly. The fish you see in front of you is proof that some of them do survive despite having been damaged by selenium. This fish has approximately half of its gill plate missing, which exposes that very, very vascular and fragile material in the gills to direct damage. Clearly, this fellow made it, but we're starting to see pictures of fish like this on social media more frequently. Most of them where they can be identified as to location seem to come from coal mining areas. Besides fish, there's also information that's come out on impacts on animals like bighorn sheep. There was a study that looked at multiple herds of bighorns and found that the various tissue levels of selenium were highest in the bighorns living on or adjacent to old mine sites. They also found that the sheep near the mines had the lowest reproductive rates of any of the sheep that they looked at. There's also evidence, and it's spelled out in more detail in Bill Donohue's paper, of damage to the water that can impact agricultural values downstream. That's not a big problem in the McLeod River area where none of the water is used for irrigation or other agricultural things. But here in southern Alberta, where a great deal of water is used for irrigated farmland, the possibility that the changes in the water coming out of mines could make the water unusable for irrigation is a very major concern. Again, Benga did not appear to pay any attention to this. If you reference Bill's studies, look at the material on what he calls the sodium adsorption ratio, SAR. That's a rough measure of the ability to use the water for irrigation. It goes up into at least potentially dangerous levels in all the samples downstream of mines in the McLeod River area. Another of the things that coal leads to is damage from exploration, even before we get to a mine. The process of figuring out where the coal is, how much rock lies over it, and things of that nature leads to the building of large amounts of roadway and drill pads. That means that what used to be a forest sponge that absorbed and slowly released water becomes basically a parking lot, and the water leaves it in a hurry. It has a problem in that while it's leaving, it takes a whole lot of sediment with it, which ends up in streams. Sediment is not good for streams. It's not good for any of the aquatic communities, including the fish. Again, referencing Bill Donohue's work, you will see some material in there noting large drops in the populations of those types of flies that fly fishermen are particularly fond of. The number and lengths of exploration roads that are being created right now in the southern eastern slopes far exceed the limits that are tolerable for wildlife. Brad will reference that. There are also problems with reclamation. The companies doing this almost never, if not always, are not required to post reclamation bonds. The length of roads far exceeds the legislated limits that are supposed to control what we call linear development. Those limits are laid out in a variety of pieces of legislation and regulation. The Alberta Land Stewardship Act, the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, the plans for controlling development and use in the Livingston Porcupine areas. And even if we wanted to, we no longer have the enforcement staff required to police this. There have been major cuts to the enforcement staff in Alberta Environment and Parks, as we learned recently. With that, I'll turn it over to Bobby to wind things up.
Thanks very much, Alan. But one of the things I'll just mention before we get into the next set of slides is we have tried really hard to focus on evidence and facts in terms of the information that we have shared both with the policy committee and the public. I know that we all have a lot of emotion about this. In fact, I can get as wound up as anyone, in terms of the concerns. But I think it's important that, we raise concerns based on facts. And perhaps one of the most disturbing things in this whole process is that there is so much evidence showing that this is not a good idea. As Alan went through, we have not only studies and reports, we have real life experience right here in Alberta and certainly in BC that, raise a lot of concerns about this proceeding. Those people who are really pro-coal, for the most part, are so because of two things. They believe that somehow these adverse impacts can be overcome. And they're also convinced that there is significant economic benefit. Just based on Alan's material, I think you can see that we have grave doubts about the ability to address, the human, environmental, and, all the other negative impacts. We've also done some work to take a look at whether or not, what do the cost benefits actually look like when you look at the whole picture. And there's a couple of really big concerns here. Typically what happens with a coal mine is that the mining proponents promise, some very significant benefits in terms of financial value, jobs, etc. However, as was shown by the decision of the Joint Review Panel in the Grassy Mountain case, often, even if these benefits were correct, the environmental and health risks definitely outweigh them. On the other side of it, the benefits are rarely what they're promised to be. And there was actually a study done by an independent economist and a group of her colleagues at the end of last year, where they took a look at what had happened in Northeast BC. And they actually did all of the detailed analysis over a 20-year period around what benefits accrued to the region compared to what had been promised by the coal companies. And one of the key points that was made, and this work was done by Robin Allen, who some of you may know, who's an independent economist. But one of the key findings was that for the 20-year period from 1999 to 2019, the company had predicted that there would be $250 million in corporate taxes paid. The study revealed there were zero corporate taxes paid. So, that's just an indication of, how inflated some of the numbers are, even with respect to jobs. Often the jobs are significantly less than what was promised, and there's great uncertainty around when the jobs will occur, how long they will last. There's always layoffs and other challenges when the market dips. And there's also very little financial value from royalties. Alberta has about the lowest royalty rates in the world, and most of those royalties don't kick in until after all of the costs of the mine have been paid. So initially those rates are somewhere in the order of 1%. If you compare that to other countries, and I'll use Australia as an example, the royalty metallurgical coal can be as high as 22%. So I don't say that because I think we should have higher royalty rates. I don't think we should have coal. But again, it points to the fact that there is a lot of misinformation out there with respect to the benefits and the costs of coal. I think the other thing that's really important is that when these companies do their projections of costs and benefits, they aren't actually required under Alberta's rules to do a comprehensive cost benefit analysis. And I think that's something that should concern everyone, because it doesn't look at the costs. What are the downsides associated, with this type of development? It only identifies, what they're thinking could be benefits. As I said earlier, when it comes to jobs, coal is probably one of the worst ways to create new jobs because of the uncertainty in the market. And just as a contrast, last year, in the middle of a pandemic, there were more than 4,000 new jobs created in Alberta from sustainable. That is vastly more than the total number that are projected from coal if all of the coal mines that have been proposed were to go ahead. The other thing that they haven't looked at is the potential impact of coal mining on other industries. Coal mines are simply not compatible with many of our current high value industries. So things like ranching, agriculture, tourism, people who migrate to this area because of the lifestyle that it affords, things like the film and TV industry. They all generate significantly more jobs and financial benefits than coal, and they would all be adversely affected if the coal mining were to proceed. In fact, it's kind of interesting to note that other countries have done this analysis as well, one of them being Australia. And there was a situation in New South Wales where the coal companies went through a judicial process, and the environmental court turned down their application for a new metallurgical mine, the same type of mine that is proposed here in Alberta, because of the impact, the negative economic impact on other industries in the region. So it's definitely something that needs to be weighed and considered in this process. Then what about the financial risk? So that doesn't get much of an airing, but the truth is that there is a lot of uncertainty around the financial viability of the companies that are proposing to develop mines. And I think we've all seen that historically with companies like Grand Cash and many others, where they change owners every several years. There's bankruptcies, then someone buys up the assets, tries to start up. Most of these companies that have been identified and want to do projects in the Eastern Slopes are in fact relatively small shell companies. They may be linked to very large organizations in Australia. So you've probably heard that with Benga Mining, for example, it's owned by billionaire Gina Reinhardt. She's got very deep pockets, but those deep pockets don't apply to what they're going to do in Alberta. And that's because the way companies set up their businesses is to minimize their liability and risk. So these coal companies are solely responsible for the assets in Canada. Their financial viability does not go back to the parent company. If there's a problem, if costs are significantly higher than what they have projected, if there's an environmental disaster, then the only place they have to go in terms of financial viability is the assets that they own in Canada. And coal companies are extremely vulnerable to coal markets, coal quality, unexpected costs. What about the ongoing costs for selenium management after a mine is closed? I mean, look at the stats that Alan was sharing with you from the McLeod River. I mean, those numbers, you're talking hundreds of times toxicity levels over and above what is supposed to be our guidelines. And these mines have been closed. Where's the funding and the responsibility for ensuring that actual cleanup occurs. And then there's the cost of reclamation itself, which is typically extremely underfunded. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples when you look on the slide. So Benga's asset, the only thing that they've got going for them is Grassy Mountain. Montum is their Tent Mountain and their Chinook projects. These companies do not have a lot of money. In fact, they have all been losing money over the last few years. A couple of the companies aren't publicly listed, so I couldn't go in and take a look at their, direct financials. But to give you an example, Montum, which is pushing hard for the new Tent project or Tent Mountain project, currently has a market cap of about $8 million. Now, that number goes up and down because what the market cap reflects is just the value of their shares at a point in time, times the number of shares that have been issued. But to give you a comparison, that 8 million compares to a company like Teck, that has a market cap of about 12 billion. Atrum Coal, currently has a market cap, or as of the end of June, had a market cap of about $16 million. They are not deep pockets. And as I said earlier, if things go wrong, as they inevitably do, we all have reason to be concerned about who is going to take financial accountability for cleanup and for addressing any of the concerns that are. The other thing that I found disturbing, as I was doing my research into this, is just the issues that exist with respect to the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Department of Environment, who are supposedly our world-class legislation and are supposed to protect us from any of the downsides associated with coal and other industrial development. Well, when you look at what the Auditor General's findings were, it gives you pause, because they found a tremendous lack of clarity between the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Department of Environment. There was significant confusion over who was responsible for funding and providing the money for cleanup. There were management and accounting gaps related to environmental liabilities. And many of these same issues had been raised in an earlier Auditor General report that was issued in 2015. And in June, when this report came out, basically the Auditor General was saying that there had been little or no progress on those previous recommendations. So I think it's fair to say that these protections that are constantly referred to by politicians and people in government that are to give us confidence that we don't need to be concerned about what's going to happen if this development proceeds is not supported by the evidence, including the evidence by their own Auditor General, who has identified that we have major concerns with these processes. Another major area of concern is mine liability and risk. So one of the things that happens with these mines, obviously, is that some of the most significant costs are associated with reclaiming the land after it has been mined. And there is always a risk, as I mentioned earlier, because of volatility in the marketplace and everything else, that a company may not be around at the time that reclamation has to take place. So the government does have a mine financial security program, which is supposed to provide for those types of situations. Well, as was identified in the government's own data and was referenced in the Auditor General's report, the fund liabilities currently exceed the security that has been collected from the mining companies by about $30 billion. Now, mind you, this doesn't just refer to coal. It includes the oil sands and other larger mines, but it is indicative of the gap between the amount of money that is identified as necessary to be collected from the companies and what it's actually going to cost clean these things up. And you may hear, if you actually talk to some people in the Alberta Energy Regulator, you may hear things like, well, the coal companies are actually now providing, all of the reclamation funding up front. Unfortunately, the amount that is identified that is required is really put forward by the companies. And in many cases, the amount is significantly less than what is typically required for reclamation. So there is still a pretty significant gap there. There's also no funding available anywhere for the legacy cleanup. And there is no bonds or financial security required at all for people who are doing coal exploration. So it leaves some pretty big gaps in terms of the financial risk that Albertans could face for reclamation and cleanup after these mines are done. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what's happened with respect to Alberta policy. And I think a lot of this is fairly well known, but it was interesting to us as we did the research that this has been happening, that the gradual reduction in the legislative protections has been taking place over a number of years. So going back to what Alan had talked about with respect to the McLeod River and Greg River and whatnot, the monitoring associated with that was stopped in 2016. And it was stopped at a time when the toxicity levels were extremely high. And we have no visibility of what's happened since then. Then in March of 2018, the government basically through a stroke of a pen in a report buried on the Alberta Energy Regulator site, doubled the allowed selenium guideline. So historically in Alberta and pretty much most of Canada, the guideline has been 1 billion parts per million. But in March of 2018, that was doubled to 2. And the only rationale that was given, it was literally just a number that showed up in a chart inside of a report. There was no announcement or discussion associated with it. Had no other rationale than that's the number that BC had chosen to use. So not based on scientific evidence. In fact, the evidence would suggest that the number should go down instead of up. That's the case, in terms of what's happening in Montana, for example. Then in April of 2020, there was a significant change to the requirements for coal companies in terms of the steps that they had to go through in making an application for development. There was something called Directive 61, which had been about a 300+ page document that had a lot of detail around what coal companies needed to do in order to get an approval. And it included a full cost benefit analysis. That directive, again, with really no announcement or consultation, was rescinded and replaced with a 40-page, very general guideline, all in the interests of red tape reduction. Of course, we're all familiar that in May of 2020, the government rescinded the 1976 coal policy, which opened up all of previously protected lands for development, exploration and development. And then in October of 2020, there was a move by the government to change the Oldman River water allocation order to make water available for the coal companies. And I think with all the public outcry that hasn't progressed, but certainly a very concerning step and something that we need to be aware of when we're considering the protections that exist. In terms of actions that have been taken since then to try and address the concerns, the minister did announce in February of this year that the 1976 coal policy was being reinstated until the coal policy committee had completed their recommendations and decisions had been made. And while that sounds really good, it actually didn't change anything. And I say that because almost immediately after the rescinding of the policy, the government had had allowed industry to obtain coal leases for virtually all of the Category 2 land. So there's like 186,000 hectares of land that was leased almost immediately, and those leases are still valid. And until recently, companies were still proceeding with exploration. Now that exploration was paused at the end of April. So I don't think we can take as much comfort as perhaps we would like from these measures. And it's why it is so incredibly important that the Coal Policy Committee, understands the issues and the risks and bring forward recommendations that will protect the Eastern Slopes from coal development. I talked a little bit about this already, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but fundamentally the land use planning that was put in place, like the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan and a number of things like the Livingston and Porcupine Hills Footprint Management Plan are incomplete. And some of the regional plans haven't been completed at all. The AER process, and speaking as somebody who has tried to use it to get information on what is happening specifically with respect to coal exploration and permits, is very much a black box. It is difficult to use. There's very limited public visibility, and it is very hard to get any kind of detail on what is actually happening. And as I mentioned, there is, and you can find this out when you talk to people in both the AER and the Department of Environment, there is a lot of confusion. And the other thing that I think everybody should be aware of is even those people who are doing their absolute best in those groups to fulfill their job are under tremendous pressure because of the cutbacks and the layoffs that occurred. And there really are inadequate resources to do the work that is required, to protect the Eastern Slopes. Finally, to wrap up, the Eastern Slopes are incredibly important. They're highly valued. All of the evidence that we have been able to access demonstrates that coal mining will cause significant irreversible damages. We don't see the economic benefits that people keep referring to, and certainly even to the extent that there are any, they don't outweigh the environmental consequence. And there's been really no proper analysis of what will happen to other high value industries. And just to give you a quick example, we talk about, there'll be all these jobs from coal. Well, today the coal industry, all of the coal mines existing in Alberta employ only about 1,500 people. If you compare that to agriculture and food processing, that number is somewhere in the area of 77,000 people. It also doesn't take into account the billions of dollars that come from the agricultural industry, from the tourism industry to Alberta. And as I mentioned earlier, there's very little that would give us reason to think that there'll be anywhere close to those kind of benefits coming from development of the coal resource. Finally, our recommendations, and basically they're pretty straightforward. They're fairly consistent with some that have been brought forward by other groups with respect to no coal development in the Eastern Slopes. We don't think that there should be any differentiation based on land category, and we want these to be permanent legislated protections. We think that the existing mines need to be allowed to retire gracefully, but that there should be no expansions or extensions, of those mines. We're also very concerned about the coal exploration work that has been done. Alan showed a picture in his presentation. The destruction is actually quite significant and it needs to be cleaned up. And we believe that that should be addressed sooner rather than later. And finally, and this is one that we feel quite strongly about and that it needs to be part of the Policy Committee's recommendations to government, is that there needs to be a plan to monitor and to clean up the existing mines and the contaminated sites. They have been left for many decades and are continuing to leach selenium and other toxic elements into our waterways and into the earth, and it really needs to be cleaned up. Okay, that is the end of the Livingston Landowners presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Thank you, Bobby and Alan. That is a significant amount of information that you have both have done a graceful job of delivering in a very short period of time. So thank you. We're just coming up to the top of the hour, but we do have a couple of questions that have been put forth. So let's quickly address them. We may run over the 1 hour time a little bit. I hope that's okay with you, Brad. And then we will just move on to the second component. And at the end, if we still have time, we can further address your questions pertaining to Bobby and Alan's presentation. So one of the questions that has come up is, please clarify and expand upon the inherent dangers of our food supply when irrigated water, which has been contaminated as you described, and any concerns, actions associated with being undertaken by the agricultural community. And they thanked you very much for the informative presentation. So I guess the bottom line is inherent dangers in our food supply.
I guess that one falls in my area, Jen. There's a little bit of selenium in water naturally. If the mine goes through, there will be more selenium. Essentially, what happens is enriched selenium or increased selenium in the irrigation water is taken up by cows or it's taken up by the vegetation, which in turn is fed to the cows or other livestock. In the Lethbridge area, a lot of that livestock is in confined feeding operations. So there's a giant pile of manure created. That in turn happens to have enriched selenium levels, and it's then taken and spread on the land. So we have increased selenium from the water. We have increased selenium from the manure. The crops grown get even more selenium, and it becomes a never-ending cycle. For those who want a more detailed explanation on it, there was a letter by Lee Elder in Western Stock Grower last summer that goes through it in great detail. But essentially, if you enrich or increase the selenium, there's a potential to make the agricultural lands that are irrigated with it unusable.
So there's just no escaping the food chain, is there? It just is going to make its way through our entire ecosystem.
Yes.
Oh, okay. The next question is, with all of the negative impacts listed, so water, wildlife, etc., the question is why? Why is the government allowing this? Bobby, and this is Alan, you're talking about the food supply chain and our environmental impacts. Bobby, you're talking about the economic impacts. Where's the win?
Well, it's probably pretty evident from our perspective that there isn't a win. I mean, as I mentioned, I think in my presentation, what you're hearing from people that we've spoken to in government, and certainly from people in the Crow's Nest Pass who are proponents of coal, it seems to all hinge on a belief that somehow there is significant economic benefit, and including jobs and revenue for the government, and that somehow the mining companies are actually able to manage all of these negative impacts. Clearly, we don't see that. It isn't supported by the evidence that we've accessed, but that's what we would understand to be the perspective from the other side.
So the sales pitch is, we're going to put money into your community and it's going to be worth it. Short answer from these guys. Wow. Okay. Just one more question. And you touched on this a bit, but I would really like to understand this. How do potential coal jobs and economic opportunities compare to the jobs and economic benefits from agriculture and tourism? Bobby, you touched on this, but I think this is really important just to confirm.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, if you look at the number of jobs in Alberta today from the operating coal mines, and this is from the government's own data, this isn't numbers we're making up, it's about 1,500 jobs. There was nowhere that I could find on the government websites that addressed the amount of financial benefit coming into the government in terms of impact on the GDP or anything like that, although that information is available for other industries. So then if you look at the agriculture industry as an example, you know, the number of jobs that the agricultural industry currently has is somewhere in the order of 50 to 77,000. Now that the higher number includes people in food processing.
Okay.
And they generate just in the Lethbridge County alone, which is where you've got all the irrigation, somewhere in the order of $2 billion worth of value to the GDP. And then if you look at tourism, which is another one which is deeply concerned about this industry, there's over 68,000 tourism jobs. That's full-time equivalent jobs. So the actual number would be much higher than that. And they contribute something like 6.5 billion to Alberta's GDP. And then just, I think today or yesterday, there was an article, this is related to tourism, where, you know, they're talking about the film and TV industry, you know, investing something like $500 million and 9,000 jobs. I mean, obviously, the level of interest in our beautiful scenic mountains and foothills would be adversely impacted if they become a sea of coal mines.
Okay,
So
thank
hopefully
you.
that helps.
Yeah, yeah. So what's the current status of the other proposed coal projects? Can you just summarize that, and then we will switch gears and move on to Brad?
Yeah, unfortunately, they are still active.
Okay.
So the Benga project, which we kind of were hoping would be killed with the decision by the Joint Review Panel, they're now planning to appeal that decision or request permission to appeal that decision. So that will be coming up in September.
Okay.
The Montum project, which is sort of the next one that needs consideration, they want to proceed with 10 Mountain. And they have an application in front of the Alberta Energy Regulator. So we believe, based on an announcement by the federal government, that that will be subject to a federal environmental impact assessment as well. But it is still in process. The other projects, and I won't go through them one by one, are somewhat on hold. Some of them are on Category 2 land and are very much waiting to see what happens with the Coal Policy Committee and probably the outcome of Benga and Montum's efforts.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bobby and Alan. You're